Listen here, rookie. 30 years I've been digging holes in this godforsaken cemetery, and I've seen things that would make your grandmother's ghost blush. But nothing, and I mean nothing, prepared me for what happened with Cordelia Blackthorne. It was a Tuesday when they brought her in. October, naturally, because that's when all the weird stuff happens around Willowbrook Cemetery. The funeral was small, just her nephew Reginald and a handful of what looked like distant relatives who'd probably shown up for the will reading. I remember thinking it was odd how quickly Reginald wanted her in the ground. Most folks take their time with the arrangements, you know, but this guy was practically tapping his foot during the service. I dug her grave myself, plot 47, section C, right under the old oak tree. 6 feet down, neat and tidy, just like always. The burial went smooth enough. Reginald threw his handful of dirt, shed what looked like crocodile tears, and everyone shuffled off to their cars. By evening, it was just me and Cordelia, and that's how I thought it would stay. Boy, was I wrong. The first night, I was doing my usual rounds. It was past midnight, and I had my flashlight cutting to the fog that rolls in from a river. That's when I saw her, a woman in a long, dark dress, standing right beside Cordelia's fresh grave. Victorian style, high collar, the works. At first, I figured it was just some grieving relative who'd snuck back in. Happens more than you'd think. Ma'am, I called out, walking over. Cemetery's closed after dark. She didn't turn around, didn't even acknowledge me, just stood there, perfectly still like a statue. As I got closer, I could see her lips moving, like she was having a conversation with someone. But there was no sound coming out, not a whisper. When I was maybe 10 feet away, she just vanished, didn't walk away, didn't fade out like in the movies. 1 second she was there, the next second she wasn't. I stood there with my mouth hanging open, shining my flashlight on empty air. I convinced myself I'd imagined it. 30 years of night shifts will play tricks on your mind, right? But the next night, there she was again. Same spot, same dress, same silent conversation with the grave. This time I tried approaching from behind, thinking maybe I could catch her off guard. But the moment my shadow fell across the headstone, she disappeared. This went on for 2 weeks. Every single night, like clockwork, I started bringing binoculars, watching her from a distance. Through the lenses, I could make out more details. Her skin was pale as moonlight, and her dark hair was pulled back in a style I'd seen in old daguerreotypes. But what really got me were her lips. She'd move them frantically, desperately, like she was trying to scream but couldn't make a sound. On the 14th night, I got lucky, or unlucky, depending on how you look at it. The fog was thicker than usual, and I managed to get within arm's reach before she noticed me. That's when I saw her face, clearly for the first time. It was Cordelia Blackthorne. Same sharp cheekbones, same distinctive nose I'd seen at the funeral. But her eyes, Christ, her eyes were wide with terror, and her lips were sewn shut with what looked like silver thread. The stitches were crude, hasty, like someone had done in a hurry. She turned to look at me, and I swear I felt my heart stop. She raised one pale hand and pointed down at her grave, then at her sewn lips, then back at the grave, over and over, becoming more frantic each time. I stumbled backward, tripped over my own feet, and hit the ground hard. When I looked up, she was gone again. I didn't sleep for the rest of that night. Hell, I didn't sleep for the next 3 nights. But I couldn't stop thinking about what I'd seen. Those stitches, the desperation in her eyes, the way she kept pointing at the grave. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I did something that could have cost me my job, my freedom, maybe even my life. I went back to section C with a shovel. It took me 4 hours to dig down to Cordelia's coffin. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely grip the shovel handle. When I finally pried open that mahogany lid, the smell that hit me wasn't the usual decay. It was something else. Fear, desperation, the scent of someone who died in absolute terror. Cordelia Blackthorne lay there in her burial dress, perfectly preserved, but her fingernails were broken and bloody, and there were deep scratches gouged into the satin lining of the coffin lid, scratches that could only have been made from the inside. She'd been buried alive, The silver thread was still there, sewn to her lips with surgical precision. In her hand, clutched tight in her death grip, was a piece of paper. A will, dated the day before her supposed death, leaving everything to charity instead of her nephew Reginald. I called the police that morning. Turns out Reginald had been slowly poisoning his aunt with something that mimicked death, slowed her heart rate down so much that even the doctor couldn't detect a pulse. The plan was to let her suffocate in the coffin while he inherited her fortune. He's doing life now, and Cordelia finally got a proper burial in the family plot. I haven't seen her spirit since that night I opened her coffin, but sometimes when the fog rolls in thick and the moon is dark, I can hear whispers coming from the graves. Whispers from folks who might not have gotten the peaceful death they deserved. That's why I'm telling you this. Rookie, in this job, you're not just digging holes in the ground. You're the last person who sees these folks before they go into the earth. Sometimes they need you to listen. Sometimes they need you to dig them back up. Story 2. Name's Barnabas Grimm. And yeah, I know what you're thinking about the last name. Trust me, I've heard all the jokes. Been working Ravens Hollow Cemetery for 15 years now, and I thought I'd seen everything this place had to offer. Turns out I was dead wrong. It started about 6 months ago with Mrs. Valancourt, rich old biddy who got buried with enough jewelry to stock a pawn shop. Her family insisted on a full display. Diamond rings, pearl necklace, gold bracelet, the works. She wanted to be buried with her treasures, her daughter kept saying. Fair enough. Folks get buried with stranger things. I dug the grave myself, watched them lower her down in that fancy casket with all her shiny baubles. Standard burial, nothing unusual. But 3 days later, I'm doing my morning rounds and something's off. The ground around her plot looks disturbed. Not like animals have been digging. More like someone had been real careful about covering their tracks. I figure it was probably kids messing around. Happens sometimes. But then Mr. Ashworth comes storming over, madder than a wet cat. Mortimer Ashworth, the funeral director. Been running the business longer than I've been alive. Thin as a rail, always dressed in those expensive black suits. Grim, he says, "We got a problem. Mrs. Valancourt's family is asking questions about her jewelry." Turns out, someone had opened up her casket and cleaned out every piece of jewelry she'd been buried with. Clean job, too. Whoever did it knew what they were doing. No damage to the casket, no mess left behind. Professional work. Over the next 2 months, it happened 4 more times. Always the wealthy folks. Always the ones buried with valuables. Gold watches, diamond earrings, even gold teeth fillings. The pattern was too clean, too precise. This wasn't some desperate junkie looking for a quick score. I started paying closer attention, staying later, watching the cemetery after dark. That's when I noticed Mortimer's car was still in the parking lot well past midnight on burial days. Strange, considering his office closed at 6. One night, I decided to follow him, kept my distance, stayed in the shadows between the headstones. Mortimer was carrying a canvas bag and a small spade, moving between the fresh graves like he had all the time in the world. I watched him stop at Mr. Kowalski's plot. Guy had been buried 2 days earlier with his father's gold watch. I expected to see him dig up the grave, but instead, he just knelt down and started whispering to the ground. Couldn't make out the words from where I was hiding, but his voice had this sing-song quality, like he was chanting something. Then the ground started moving, not like an earthquake or settling soil. The dirt was shifting, flowing like water, creating a neat little tunnel straight down to the casket. Mortimer reached into his bag and pulled out what looked like a silver bowl. He placed it at the edge of the hole and kept chanting. That's when I saw them floating up through the tunnel. Mr. Kowalski's gold watch, his wedding ring, and a handful of gold fillings. They drifted up like they were suspended in water, landing gently in Mortimer's bowl. I must have made some noise, because Mortimer's head snapped up and he looked straight at me. His eyes, Jesus, his eyes were completely black. Not just the pupils, the whole damn eyeball, like looking into 2 deep holes. "Barnabas," he said, and his voice carried across the cemetery like he was standing right next to me. "You shouldn't be here." I ran. 43 years old, and I ran like a scared kid, stumbling between headstones and tripping over flower arrangements. Behind me, I could hear Mortimer laughing, but the sound wasn't coming from where I'd left him. It was coming from everywhere at once, echoing off the mausoleums and tombstones. I didn't sleep that night. Hell, I didn't sleep for a week. But I couldn't leave it alone. Something was seriously wrong, and people deserved to know what was happening to their loved ones' belongings. I started researching Mortimer's family history at the local library. Turns out the Ashworths had been running funeral homes in this area for over a century, but there were gaps in the records, years where family members just disappeared from all documentation. And every generation seemed to produce at least one member who lived way longer than they should have. The current Mortimer was supposed to be 68, but I found a newspaper photo from 1987 where he looked exactly the same as he does now. Same thin face, same cold stare, same expensive suit. 2 weeks later, I worked up the courage to follow him again. This time I was ready. Brought a camera, stayed further back, kept my mouth shut. I watched him perform that same ritual at 3 different graves, collecting gold and precious stones in his silver bowl. But this time, instead of leaving afterward, he headed toward the old Ashworth family mausoleum at the center of the cemetery, the one that's been sealed up for as long as anyone can remember. I followed him inside. The place reeked of something sweet and rotten, like flowers left too long in stagnant water. Mortimer lit a series of candles, and I could see the walls were covered in symbols carved deep into the stone. At the center of the room was a hole in the floor, perfectly round, dropping down into darkness. Mortimer emptied his bowl into the hole, and I heard something down there respond. Not a voice exactly, more like a satisfied sigh that seemed to come from miles underground. Then he started talking to whatever was down there, like he was reporting to a boss. "The feeding goes well," he said. "Mrs. Valancourt's diamonds were particularly nourishing. The Kowalski gold has helped you grow stronger." Something rustled in the depths, and when it spoke, I felt the words in my bones rather than hearing them. "More," it said. "Need more. The awakening comes soon." That's when I realized Mortimer wasn't stealing from the dead for money. He was feeding something that had been growing under our cemetery for God knows how long. Something that fed on precious metals and was getting ready to wake up. I tried to back out quietly, but my foot hit a loose stone. The sound echoed through the mausoleum like a gunshot. Mortimer turned around, and this time when he smiled, I could see his teeth had been replaced with gold. "Barnabas," he said, "I was wondering when you'd join us." The last thing I remember is falling through that hole in the floor, landing hard on something that felt like wet metal. When I came to, I was surrounded by walls that pulsed like a heartbeat, made entirely of melted gold and silver and precious stones. And somewhere in the darkness, something huge was waking up. I'm telling you this because I managed to climb out somehow, but I can feel it calling to me now every night. The gold in my teeth aches, and my wedding ring burns my finger. Stay away from Mortimer Ashworth. And whatever you do, don't let them bury you with anything valuable. Trust me on this one. Story 3. #The wrong plot. Jasper Crowley's a name, and I've been keeping the grounds at Pinewood Cemetery for 22 years. In all that time, I've made exactly one mistake with burial plot. Just one. And it damn near cost me everything. It was a humid Thursday in August when they brought in old Mr. Pemberton. Heart attack, nothing unusual. His family had purchased plot 31 in Section B, nice spot under the maple trees. I dug plenty of graves in that area. Good soil, drains well, no problems. Except I was running on 3 hours of sleep and too much coffee. My wife had been up all night with the flu, and I was moving like a zombie. When I checked the burial order that morning, my tired eyes saw 13 instead of 31. Simple mistake. Happens to everyone, right? So I dug the grave in plot 13. Same section, just 20 plots over. Didn't think twice about it until I was 6 feet down and double-checked my paperwork. That's when I realized what I'd done. Plot 13 had been empty since 1889. Not because nobody wanted it. Hell, it's got a better view than most of the premium spots. But according to the old cemetery records, it was supposed to stay empty forever. The original burial order for that plot was for a woman named Thessaly Nightshade. Even in 1889, that name raised eyebrows. But she'd paid for the plot in advance, in gold coins, and her money was as good as anyone's. Problem was, when she died, her body went missing from the morgue. Just vanished overnight, leaving behind nothing but a burnt outline on the table and the smell of sulfur. The plot stayed empty, but the payment was made, so they couldn't sell it to anyone else. Over the years, people just sort of forgot why it was empty, until idiots like me came along and dug it up by mistake. I climbed out of that hole and went straight to the office to confess my screw-up. Mr. Henderson, the cemetery director, wasn't too happy, but mistakes happen. He told me to fill it back in and dig the correct grave for Mr. Pemberton's funeral the next morning. That's when things got weird. I came back with my shovel around 4 in the afternoon, planning to fill in the hole and be done with it. But when I got to plot 13, the grave I dug was full of water. Black water, still as glass, reaching right up at ground level. Now, I know every inch of the cemetery's drainage system. There's no water table that's shallow, no pipes running through that section. The nearest water source is the creek, and that's a quarter-mile away. But there it was, 6 feet of dark water that definitely hadn't been there that morning. I figured maybe a pipe had burst underground. So I called the city utilities. They sent a guy out who stuck some kind of meter in the water and nearly jumped out his skin. "This isn't city water," he said, backing away from the grave. "I don't know what the hell this is, but it's not connected to any system we maintain." He left in a hurry, and I was stuck with a grave full of mysterious black water and a funeral the next morning. I tried pumping out with a sump pump, but for every gallon I removed, 2 more seemed to seep in from somewhere. That night, I had the strangest dreams. I was standing in that grave, but instead of being 6 feet deep, it went down forever. The black water was everywhere, and I could hear a woman's voice calling from the depths, speaking words in a language that made my teeth ache. I woke up with dirt under my fingernails and my work boots caked with mud, even though I'd gone to bed in clean clothes. The next morning, I dragged myself back to the cemetery to see if the water had drained overnight. It hadn't. If anything, there was more of it, and now it was moving. Not flowing like a stream, but swirling in slow, hypnotic patterns. But that wasn't the strangest part. The headstones around plot 13, 24 granite and marble markers that stood unchanged for decades, were now covered in symbols. Deep carvings that definitely hadn't been there the day before. The symbols hurt to look at directly, like they were designed to confuse your eyes. And it was cold. Not just cool, but winter cold, even though it was 90 degrees everywhere else in the cemetery. My breath was visible when I stood near that grave. I called Mr. Henderson again, and this time he came out to see for himself. The poor man took one look at that black water and the carved symbols and went pale as a sheet. "Fill it in," he said. "Right now. Use whatever you have to, but get that hole filled." I brought in 3 truckloads of soil and started dumping it into the grave. The dirt just disappeared into that black water, like it was falling into a bottomless pit. After the 3rd truck, I gave up and called it a day. The next morning, the grave was empty again, bone dry, like it had never held water at all. But the symbols on the headstones were still there, and they seemed to be spreading to other markers nearby. That's when I started researching Thessaly Nightshade in the town's historical records. What I found made my blood run cold. She'd been accused of witchcraft by 3 different towns before settling here. Everywhere she went, children got sick, crops failed, and people reported seeing her talking to things that weren't there. Before she died, she told anyone who'd listened that she'd curse the ground where she was supposed to be buried. "Anyone who disturbs my resting place," she'd said, "will take my place in the earth." I thought it was just old superstition until I noticed something wrong with my feet. Every time I stood still for more than a few seconds, I'd start sinking. Just an inch or 2 at first, but enough to notice. Grass, concrete, wooden floors. Didn't matter what I was standing on, I'd start going down. It got worse over the following weeks. My wife noticed I was leaving footprints in our hardwood floor. Deep ones, like I weighed 1,000 pounds. At work, I'd sink into the ground up to my ankles if I stood in one spot too long. The symbols kept spreading too, appearing on headstones throughout the cemetery. And every night, I dream of Thessaly Nightshade standing in that empty grave, beckoning me down into black water that only I could see. Last week, I sank waist deep into the parking lot of the grocery store. Had to be pulled out by the fire department. They think I'm crazy, of course. How do you explain to people that you're slowly becoming part of the earth itself? I'm telling you this as a warning. Check your plot numbers twice, 3 times if you have to, because some mistakes can be undone and some ground is meant to stay undisturbed. I can feel her calling to me now, even as I'm talking to you. Thessaly Nightshade wants what she was promised, a body in that grave, and I'm starting to think mine will do just fine. The earth has been patient, but it's hungry, and I'm sinking deeper every day. Story 4. Silas Bonehart here, and before you ask, yeah, that's my real name. My great-grandfather thought it was funny when he changed it from Bonkowski back in the 20s. Real hilarious until you're applying for jobs at funeral homes and cemeteries. Anyway, I've been working the night shift at Restwood Cemetery for 8 years now. Pays better than days, and I don't mind the quiet. Or at least, I didn't until last month. See, working nights in the cemetery, you get used to weird stuff. Shadows that move when there's no wind. Whispers that might just be trees rustling. The occasional cold spot that makes your breath fog up in July. Occupational hazards, you might say. After 8 years, I thought I'd seen it all. I was wrong. It started on a Tuesday. I'd spent the afternoon preparing a grave for the next morning service. Some poor bastard named Frederick Holloway who'd keeled over at his retirement party. Standard 6-foot hole, nothing fancy. I'd marked it with the usual orange cones and headed home for a few hours of sleep before my shift started at midnight. When I came back that night for my rounds, the grave wasn't empty anymore. There was a woman in there, lying peaceful as you please in a faded blue dress. She looked maybe 30, with dark hair pinned up in an old-fashioned style. The weird part wasn't that someone was in the grave. We get vagrant problems sometimes. The weird part was that she looked like she'd been dead for decades. I climbed down with my flashlight to check on her, thinking maybe someone had moved a body from another grave as some kind of sick prank. But when I got close, I could see her lips moving slightly, like she was dreaming. Her skin was gray and waxy, but she was definitely breathing. "Ma'am," I said, feeling like an idiot. "Ma'am, you can't be here." Her eyes snapped open. They were completely white, like cataract had taken over. She sat up smooth as silk and looked right at me. "What year is it?" she asked, and her voice sounded like it was coming from the bottom of a well. 2024, I said, backing up against the grave wall. She smiled, but it wasn't a happy expression, more like disappointment. "Wrong again," she whispered, and then she crumbled to dust right in front of me, just collapsing on herself until there was nothing left but a pile of gray ash and that blue dress. I climbed out of that grave faster than I'd ever moved in my life and spent the rest of my shift chain smoking behind the maintenance shed. Told myself it was stress, maybe some kind of hallucination brought on by too much coffee and not enough sleep. But the next night, there was someone else in Frederick's grave. This time it was a man in a Union Army uniform, complete with brass buttons and a kepi hat. He was maybe 25, with a thick mustache and a bullet hole right through his forehead. Same dead-butt-breathing situation as the woman. "What year?" he asked when I woke him up. 2024, I said. Same disappointed smile. Same crumbling to dust. This went on every night for 2 weeks. Different person each time, from different eras. A flapper girl from the 20s who asked about Prohibition. A cowboy who wanted to know if the Indians were still fighting. A little girl in a Victorian dress who asked if her mama was looking for her. Always the same question. "What year is it?" Always the same result when I answered. Disappointment. Then dust. I started researching the names on the headstones around Frederick's plot, trying to figure out if these people had been buried nearby. Found records for most of them, scattered across different sections of the cemetery, different decades. Ophelia Ravencrest died in 1923. That was a flapper. Xerxes Tombwright died 1847. The cowboy. Little Minerva Darkwell died 1889. The girl in the Victorian dress. They were all real people, all buried in Restwood, but none of them anywhere near Plot 23 where I dug Frederick's grave. The breakthrough came when I found an old cemetery map from 1892 in the Historical Society archives. Turned out Plot 23 used to be the center of the original cemetery, back when it was half the size it is now. And right there, marked with a symbol I didn't recognize, was something called the crossing. I brought the map to Mrs. Chun, the cemetery's historian. She's 93 and sharp as a tack. Been keeping records here since the 1960s. "Oh my," she said when she saw the symbol. "You found one of the old crossing plots. Haven't seen one of these maps in decades." "What's a crossing plot?" I asked. She adjusted her glasses and peered at the map more closely. Back in the 1800s, people believed certain spots in cemeteries were thin places, where the boundary between our world and the next wasn't quite solid. They marked them on the maps so grave diggers would know to avoid them. Avoid them for what? Well, she said, the theory was that if you disturb a crossing plot, it might open a doorway, let things through that shouldn't be able to cross over. My blood went cold. What kind of things? The dead, dear. The dead from different times, different places. They get confused, lost. Some would try to come back through the doorway, looking for their own time. That night, I went back to Frederick's grave with a new understanding of what I was dealing with. Sure enough, there was someone new waiting for me. A man in a 1950s suit with half his face missing, probably from a car accident. "What year is it?" he asked, just like all the others. But this time, instead of telling him the truth, I took a guess based on his clothes. 1953, I said. His whole face lit up. Even the missing parts seemed to fill in with joy. "Finally," he said. "I've been looking everywhere for 1953. My Betty's waiting for me." He climbed out of the grave like it was nothing, brushed the dirt off his suit, and started walking toward the cemetery entrance. But with each step, he got fainter and fainter until he was just a pale outline against the night sky. Then he was gone. I realized what was happening. The crossing plot was pulling the dead from across time, and they were all trying to get back to their own era. But when I told them it was 2024, they knew they were in the wrong time and couldn't stay. They crumbled to dust because they didn't belong here. But if I could guess their right year, I started researching every person who appeared in that grave, finding their death dates and lying to them. Told the flapper was 1923. The cowboy was 1847. The little girl was 1889. One by one, they smiled and walked away, fading back to their own time. The last one was the hardest. A young woman in a 1970s peasant dress with flowers in her hair. She had that look people get in old photos, like she was trying to be happy but couldn't quite manage it. "What year is it?" she asked. I checked my notes. 1971, I said. She started crying. Happy tears, I think. "I can go home now," she whispered. "I can go back to the commune, back to my friends. I've been lost for so long." She hugged me, actually hugged me, and I could smell patchouli and marijuana smoke in her hair. Then she walked away, getting dimmer with each step until she disappeared entirely. That was 3 weeks ago. Frederick's grave has stayed empty since then, and I haven't seen any more displaced souls. But I keep thinking about what Mrs. Chin said about crossing plots. If there's one here at Restwood, there might be others at cemeteries all over the country. And I wonder sometimes, when I'm doing my rounds at night, if any of us really know what time we're supposed to be in. Maybe we're all just lost souls trying to find our way back home. Story 5. Tobias Scullington here. Yes, another unfortunate family name. Thank you very much. I've been digging graves and keeping records at Shadowmere Cemetery for 27 years. In that time, I've become something of an amateur historian of this place. I know every plot, every headstone, every family that's been laid to rest here since 1847. Or at least, I thought I did. Last spring, the city decided to expand the cemetery into the old Hartwell property next door. Good news for business. Bad news for me since I had to survey the land and make sure we weren't building on top of anything important. You'd be surprised how often people forget where they buried Great Aunt Mildred. I was about 50 yards into the new section when my metal detector started going crazy. Not the usual ping of a belt buckle or pocket watch. This was a sustained screech that made my teeth hurt. I started digging, figuring I'd hit some old farm equipment or maybe a forgotten septic tank. 3 feet down, I hit wood. Old wood. The kind that's been underground for so long it's more like compressed dirt than timber. But it was definitely a coffin, and a fancy one at that. Hand-carved details, metal hinges that had somehow avoided rusting completely. Problem was, there were no records of any burials on the Hartwell property. I checked every document going back to when the land was first settled. Nothing. As far as official history was concerned, nobody had ever been buried there. I should have called the city, should have stopped digging and waited for the proper authorities. But 27 years in this business makes you curious about things like unmarked graves. So I kept going. The coffin was in remarkable condition for something that had obviously been underground for decades, maybe centuries. When I pried off the lid, it opened with barely a creak. Inside was a woman who looked like she'd been buried yesterday. She was maybe 30, with long black hair spread out like a fan and skin so pale it was almost translucent. Her dress was something from the 1600s or 1700s, all black silk and intricate embroidery. But what really caught my attention were her hands. They were folded over her chest, and her fingers were stained dark red, like she'd been dipping them in blood. I leaned in closer to get a better look, and that's when her eyes opened. Not gradually, like someone waking up from a nap. They just snapped open, completely alert, staring right at me. Her eyes were the palest blue I'd ever seen, almost white, like winter ice. "Finally," she said, and her voice was crisp and clear, with an accent I couldn't place. I was beginning to think no one would ever find me. I fell backward, scrambling away from the grave on my hands and knees like some kind of crab. She sat up smooth as silk, like rigor mortis had never set in. "Please don't run," she said, climbing out of the coffin with impossible grace. "I've been waiting so very long to speak with someone. Lady, I managed to croak. You were dead. You were definitely dead." She laughed, and it sounded like wind chimes in a storm. "Dead? Oh, my dear man, I haven't been dead. I've been sleeping. There's quite a difference, you know." She brushed dirt off her dress and looked around at the cemetery with interest, like she was seeing it for the first time. "How long has it been?" she asked. I checked the carved date on her coffin lid. 1692. My hand was shaking so bad I could barely read the numbers. "About 330 years," I said. "Wonderful," she said, clapping her hand together. "That should be quite long enough." "Long enough for what?" She smiled, and I noticed her teeth were too sharp, like someone had filed them to points. "For people to forget what I am, of course. For the stories to become legends, and the legends to become myths. For the precautions to be forgotten." That's when she told me her name, Xanthia Doomhaven. And as soon as she said it, I felt something cold crawl up my spine, like my body recognized a danger my mind hadn't caught up to yet. "I'm what your ancestors would call a plague bringer," she explained, walking among the headstones like she was browsing in a library. "My gift or curse, depending on your perspective, is to carry diseases that affect the dead. Not the living, mind you. I'm perfectly harmless to anyone with a beating heart." "Then why were you buried alive?" I asked, though I was starting to get a horrible idea. "Because 3 centuries ago, people understood what would happen if I died in a populated area. The contagion I carry doesn't activate until my heart stops beating. But once it does..." She gestured toward the rows of graves surrounding us. "Well, let's just say the results are rather dramatic." As if on cue, I heard something rustling beneath the ground near her feet. The soil was shifting, like something underneath was trying to push its way to the surface. "You see," Xanthia continued, "the plague I carry awakens the dead, not as the shambling monsters from your movies. They retain their intelligence, their memories, their personalities. They simply return. All of them. Every person who's died within several miles of where my heart stops beating." More rustling now, coming from graves all across the cemetery. Old headstones were shifting, settling, as the earth beneath them moved. "The fascinating thing," she said, "is that no one among the living can see them. They exist in the same space, walk the same streets, but they're invisible to anyone still breathing. A parallel world of the returned dead, going about their business while the living remain blissfully unaware. I backed toward my truck, but she held up a hand. I'm afraid I can't let you leave just yet, Tobias. You see, I need someone to witness what happens next. Someone to remember, to carry the story forward. What happens next? She placed her hand over her heart, and I could hear it beating. Slow, steady, ancient. I've been sleeping for over 3 centuries, sustained by magic that's finally running out. In a few moments, my heart will stop and the plague will activate. Every soul buried in Shadowmere Cemetery will wake up, and they'll walk among your town forever, unseen by the living but very much present. The rustling was getting louder now. I could see hands pushing up through the soil, pale fingers clawing at the earth. Don't worry, Xanthia said as her heartbeat began to slow. They won't harm anyone. They simply want to continue living in their own way. Your town will be fuller than it's ever been. You just won't be able to see half the population. Her heart stopped with an almost audible thud, and she collapsed gracefully beside her grave. That's when they started emerging. Hundreds of them, maybe thousands. Every person buried in Shadowmere over the past century and a half, climbing out of their graves like they were getting out of bed. Old and young, rich and poor, all looking exactly as they had when they died, but moving with purpose and intelligence. I watched the Victorian-era family dust off their burial clothes and start walking toward town, chatting about what they'd missed. A group of miners from the 1920s were comparing notes about working conditions. Children who died decades apart were already playing together, laughing silently in the moonlight, and none of them paid any attention to me. I was invisible to them, just as they would be invisible to everyone else still breathing. I'm telling you this story because I need someone to know what really happened to our town. Why it sometimes feels crowded even when the streets look empty. Why you might feel watched when no one's around, or hear conversations in rooms you thought were vacant. They're here, all of them, living their afterlives right alongside us. And thanks to Xanthia Doomhaven's plague, they always will be. Sometimes I wonder if I'm the only living person who can see them, or if the shock of that night changed something in me. Either way, I've learned to nod politely when dead folks say hello, and I always keep an extra chair at my dinner table. You never know when you might have invisible company.